So GDP, what is it and what does it represent? GDP is short for gross domestic product. By definition, GDP is a monetary measure of the market value of all the final goods and services produced and sold in a specific time-bound period by countries and of course their economies. Relative to FX, we look at the monthly, quarterly and annually data, also known as a year-over-year, quarter-over-quarter and month-over-month GDP data releases. Think of GDP as the internal health of an economy. I like to think of it as the overall economic output. Some people even refer to it as the revenue like a business makes. Economies, similar to businesses, go through cycles throughout their lifetimes. While some economies may be growing and strengthening internally, others may be contracting and shrinking due to less business and economic activity occurring. All economies are like businesses. When we're in an environment of economic growth, some businesses will grow significantly more than others, making them more appealing to investors as their investment will likely return more ROI, return on investment. The same applies to economies. In environments of global growth, some economies perform better than others for many factors we will cover. By proxy, strengthening their currency and making their currency tremendously appealing to investors and traders. As traders, we are looking for divergences. As one economy is strengthening, we are looking to capitalize on this strength over an economy that is weakening. In other words, we are looking for complete opposites, strong versus weak always. The economic cycle. There are several economies that have long-term growth and their GDP has been rising for some time now. Now, on the other hand, the GDP of some countries has been declining for a long period of time and therefore suffering negative growth. Every economy will experience periods of growth, strengthened economies in other words, and periods of decline, weakening economies. But our jobs as traders is to identify the strong economies and buy them versus the weak economies, as one currency is very probable to appreciate and strengthen over the other, making the technicals simple when we get to them. The economic cycle. Now, we're going to cover each stage of the economic cycle and then put it into a visual representation at the end, so bear with us. Every economy goes through peaks, troughs. You may have heard that saying in life. We all go through peaks and troughs. But let's look at each component of the GDP cycle, or also known as the economic cycle. Stage 1, expansion. First stage in the economic cycle is expansion, which typically occurs after an economy has been suffering the worst for its downturn and economic output starts to increase. At this stage, there is an increase in positive economic indicators such as employment, income, business output, wages, profits, demand, all the good stuff. Debtors are generally paying their debts back on time. The velocity of the money supply within the economy is high and investment is high. A lot of money is passing hands in this economy and a lot of spending is occurring. This process continues as long as economic conditions are favourable for expansion. Stage 2, growth. Growth follows expansion. Due to expansion internally within the economy, we see consistent positive prints in GDP due to all the economic factors intensifying the output of the economy. This can lead to an economic boom in which mass amounts of spending are occurring all at once with major business activity being outputted, leading to a larger number of transactions and revenue generation churning inside of the economy. Booms can be considered the third phase in an economic cycle if experienced, but of course not every economy will boom. Stage 3, peak. The economy then reaches a saturation point, or known as a peak, which is the turning point of the economic cycle. The maximum limit of growth is reached, and the economic indicators do not grow any further and are at their highest they will be in this cycle. Prices are at their peak, but more about the prices in the next session. This stage indeed does mark the reversal point in the trend of economic growth, and consumers tend to restrict their budget at this point as prices are so high and spending must be strategic from consumers. Stage 4 and 5, contraction into recession. Contraction is the stage that follows the peak as GDP now starts to breathe shallower. In other words, less and less economic activity is being outputted, which leads to potentially negative GDPs, which leads to a recession. The demand for goods and services start declining rapidly, causing less economic output. Producers do not notice the decrease in demand instantly and go on producing as they were before. This creates a situation of excess supply in the market. Prices tend to then fall, and all positive economic indicators such as income, output, wages consequently start to fall with them. It is important to note that not all contractions lead to recessions. The growth data in the economy will in fact confirm if a recession is inbound or not, but more about this in the next session. Stage 6, depression. Now, depression can occur in between the recession and the bottoming out of an economy, which is known as the trough, depending on how bad the economic decline actually is. There is a tremendous rise in unemployment, the growth in the economy continues to decline, and as this falls below the steady growth line, this stage is called a depression. Business activity is low, and overall the economy is struggling. The economy's currency will reflect this. Stage 7, depression and trough. Trough in the depression stage, indeed this can happen. There is further decline in GDP until the prices in the economy, as well as the demand and supply of goods and services, contract to reach their lowest point. This is where the economy is essentially at the worst it will be. The economy then eventually reaches the trough, and there is extensive depletion of national income and expenditure, and the government likely are supporting the citizens of their economy through numerous ways. Growth is flattening and the economy is at its worst. Stage 8, recovery. Recovery after the trough. So the economy moves to the stage of recovery, and in this phase there is a turnaround in the economy, and it begins to recover from all the negative GDP rates it's experienced and all the decline that has been going on over the past months and potentially even years. Demand starts to pick up due to low prices, and consequently supply begins to increase. The population develops a positive attitude towards investment and employment, and the production starts increasing. Employment begins to rise, and due to accumulated cash balances with the bankers, lending also shows positive signals. In this phase, depreciated capital is replaced, leading to new investments in the production process. Recovery continues until the economy returns to the steady growth levels and starts to expand, and we see some growth, and of course the economic cycle would continue. Now, all the phases we have covered marks a full cycle in the economic cycle, and we've just discussed everything from peaks to troughs. Now, let's take a look at the visual representation of this. So guys and girls, here we have a visual representation of course, the economic cycle. Now, a good case study for this is COVID. Once economies reopened and resumed, we started to see spending increase in the economy. For those of you that are from the UK, you'll remember Eat Out to Help Out and many schemes that were encouraging consumers to go out and spend their saved money to get the GDP moving within the economy and get businesses earning, hiring, and so on and so forth. So, as we came out of COVID lockdowns, the economy started to recover, and this happened globally. Every economy that hit lockdowns had to slowly reintroduce, and of course recovery started occurring. From here, economies grew and expanded, and we saw a global bounce back in GDP, and then of course the growth phase comes into it, just an additional phase onto the expansion, and in due course economies will then peak. The next phase is naturally we hit a contraction, less spending is occurring, people can't afford the prices of things, we will get onto this. A recession naturally follows if the contraction is severe, and from here we see a depression potentially depending on how bad the recession is. From there an economy will naturally hit a trough where prices are low enough, the economy has contracted enough to a stage where things become cheap enough to reinvest into, the economic activity starts to pick up once again, and of course a recovery is then instilled into the economy, and you can see how the cycle continues. The idea is that these economies on the left are strong, growing, strengthening economies that are appreciating in value internally, and the currency will represent this. And the economies on the right in these phases are economies that are contracting and shrinking in value, and quite literally are devaluing internally, therefore their currency shall represent this too. We look for divergences and to buy strong against weak, always looking for that economic edge. Now that we've discussed the economic cycle and put a visual representation to it, why we use the economic cycle. Our goals as traders is to be able to identify which economies are expanding, growing, booming, and whose economies is struggling, declining, and in pain. We do this through many factors that you will learn to identify in this short course, and GDP is the start of all of this. In other words, we would then have a strong versus weak economy narrative, and the currency should then represent this via the strength and weakness respectively. So the 4 goals of utilising the economic cycle. Goal 1 is to identify strong economies and weak economies via the GDP data. Goal 2, identify where an economy is on their economic cycle and why. Goal 3, correlate this to price action and establish value. And goal 4, express your bias through technical based entry, buying bargains and selling expensive.